Hey there investors, welcome to another video and Happy New Year. In this video we'll be looking at JP Morgan. The ticker symbol for JP Morgan is JPM. And the reason we'll be looking at JP Morgan is because of unusual option activity. We look at unusual option activity because we want to try to follow the smart money. And the smart money is made up of large, sophisticated institutional investors with buying power in the millions. Remember, these are investors who are buying large volumes of call option contracts or large volume of put option contracts, thinking that a price of the stock is going to follow in that direction. And this is what we define as unusual option activity. The great thing about options is that they give us a time frame, which is the expiration date of the contracts. They also give us a strike price, which is where they think the stock price is going to go. As investors, we can try to take advantage of all that information by following their trades or take a more conservative position to try to make a return. Remember, these videos are for entertainment purposes only. Please check out the disclaimer in the description below, as well as other information covered in this video. So with that being said, let's take a look at what's been going on with JP Morgan and its stock. So looking at today, there was a big sell-off in the market. And kind of looking into the news, sell-off really is kind of attributed to a few things, but more than anything, it's been a lot of rallies, and it could be that stocks are pulling back because of mispricing in the market. There's also more concerns about a new coronavirus variant and maybe more imposed national lockdowns. So I think recent news broke out about the new variant being identified in New York or something like that. And then also you get news from investors, billionaire investor Carl Icahn, who said that, wild rallies with a lot of mispriced stocks eventually hit a wall and go into a major painful correction. So there's kind of some negative news out there, right? So there's kind of what is driving this sell-off that's going on in the market. But with that being said, let's look at what the unusual option activity is telling us about JP Morgan. And when we look at the most active options traded, we see that JP Morgan call options and put options are fairly divided. You can see that 93% of investors think that or are bullish on the stocks, thinking that JP Morgan will go up, and only 6.8% are bearish on the stock, thinking it will go down. So let's take a look at some of the news surrounding JP Morgan specifically to try to understand what exactly is driving this sentiment around the stock and around the company. So when we look at some of the headlines that have come out lately, we see that some news just broke out that JP Morgan, Berkshire, and Amazon are going to be winding down their joint healthcare venture that I guess they had set up. And you can see that that's pretty much what's taking up the headlines, treasury yields. But I want to sort of emphasize a few of these where it talks about JP Morgan specifically. So you see here JP Morgan Chase strongly poised for 2021. And looking at this article, we see that they note that JP Morgan was essentially hit pretty hard during the pandemic or the darker days of the pandemic, because a lot of the banks were sensitive to the recession that investors were thinking was imminent. And this was mainly due to the demand of loans decreasing and the default rate also increasing, as well as the fear that companies would close down their businesses, and so the banks would have to book major credit loss provisions on their financial statements, as well as lower interest rates, right? So all these factors were driving down the stock of JP Morgan, causing it to go down to the lows that we saw during the pandemic. And that's really what the article is attributing the decline in the stock there. But we see lately that the stock has been rallying since then. And when we look back at the article, they attribute the rally in the stock with the lower than expected credit loss provisions, So the bank was originally expecting on their financial statements that they would lose a certain amount of money on their loans, but actually ended up losing less than they thought. As well, here you can see that they beat their EPS estimates and also had trading or strong trading revenues. So this was also something that we were seeing as a trend, with a lot more people coming into the market and kind of a record high number of brokerage accounts being created because of the increased interest in trading and the market and investing in general. So we can see that this article is attributing some of the rallying to those points, but then going forward we see that the article is also noting that there are other reasons to be bullish on just banks in general, and this is mainly due to the Federal Reserve recently allowing major banks to continue to raise their capital return programs, so offering future dividend payments and stock repurchases, which we know that JP Morgan recently announced. We also know that in comparison to the rest of the market, the financial sectors or the banks have PE ratios that are much lower than some of the more overpriced areas that we see, like over here, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon. And then when you look at the financials, JP Morgan, Bank of America really are still pretty small relative to the rest of the market. So with that being said, these are mainly some of the reasons that investors, or this article is saying investors should be bullish on JP Morgan. And looking at that, we can see that those are pretty solid points. So it could be the reason why some of the investors are so bullish on JP Morgan in general, and that's what could be driving this increase in call option ratio. So we can take a look and see, if we dive deeper into that ratio, to see what exactly is making up that volume and which expiration dates we're seeing that volume increase in specifically, so that we can try to gauge exactly when and at what price investors think that JP Morgan will reach. And when we look at the total option chain, we see that roughly around the January 15th expiration, there's a huge volume of options here of roughly 461,000. And when you look at that option chain, you see that there's a just like huge influx in this range right here, right? So like the 100s, but then when you go down to the 125-ish and above ranges, you also see that there's more influx here of option contracts being traded. And so when we look deeper into the details of these options and we filter, say, for example, on the same expiration date on the bar chart website for the open interest, we see that investors are somewhat placing big bets for a 130 strike price range, right? So investors are thinking that JP Morgan could potentially hit a 130 stock price. And if we look at the option chain, we can see that that is sort of what we're seeing there when we see the open interest, or the contracts that are still open and haven't been closed on this specific call option position. So when we put in the numbers there, see that's roughly 5.4 million, right? So that's a lot of money flowing into that. And when we look at some of these other volumes, we see that roughly this huge influx is roughly in that 120 to or 100 to 130 range, right? So anywhere around that range is pretty much a safe bet. The stock's currently trading around 125. So now we kind of want to ask, do we think that JP Morgan is likely to hit this stock price either anywhere between 130 or 120? And to answer that question, we want to look at some technical analysis. And I pointed out a few of the points here, specifically drawing attention to this line, kind of where we're trading at now. We're seeing that in the past, this range has served as a level of resistance, but also support. You can see here that when the stock broke this level of support, it just went back down, right? Because of the fears in the pandemic and all of that. And we're trading back up to these levels. And when we look at previous history, we can see that roughly around this level is when the stock broke out and climbed to its highs of roughly 140. So that is a strong indicator. We can also see that the lower moving average has crossed all of the higher moving averages, being the 50 and the 100 day in red. So that's also a strong indicator of bullishness. And on the day specifically, we can see that the stock is trending in that direction, even with today's sell-off that we saw in the market. But this is one definitely that we would want to watch closely on. So there's a good probability that the stock, if it breaks this level of resistance and level which has served as support in the past, could be reaching or shooting to reach its previous highs of 130-ish, 140s. So that's a pretty strong signal that the stock does have the possibility of reaching that. And then also, keep in mind that with some of the sentiment going on in general in the market, this has the potential to also be a two-way trade. So when we look at that, we want to really see and think about what our position will be and why. And sort of thinking through that, really looking at it, it seems that the most conservative position would be to take contracts trading back right around roughly the range where the stock is at now. And when we look at the option chain, we see that probably one of the safest one is around the 120 range. And that's mainly because we're trading right at this level of support or range that has served as support and resistance. So that range would give us a good level of protection on the downside should conditions go bearish. Of course, also considering that we would close any positions if the market goes in a certain direction versus another. So then, with that being said, the trade idea here would really be to get into the 120 strike price with an expiration of January 15th, roughly around a price range of 6.4 per contract. And then this would be our entry point for this position would really be with the stock above the simple moving average of the 5-day range, which comes out to be 125, and that is based on our cheat sheet or previous levels that we've seen in the past. And then moving on, we can see that the levels of profit taking and closing the contracts would be as follows, and then these are also based on levels which the stock has reached in the past. So you see here the pivot point, the first level of resistance, and then the second level of resistance. And when we look at more analysis from some of these third-party websites, we can also see that this is roughly where we're at now, and there's not much resistance or established resistance above these levels. So this is a good indicator if we were to break out to the upside. And on the downside, we can see levels of support reaching right around the 120s. So that being said, that's sort of the reason why the 120 strike price is kind of a more conservative position, taking in mind where support levels are down below the range where the stock is at now. So that right there would be our levels in a bullish market. However, if the sentiment in the market continues and the sell-off continues, then a good strategy, should conditions turn on the downside, would be to get on the puts below the 5-day moving average of 125. So if the stock is trading in sort of like a bearish or bear flag pattern below this level, then that's where we would want to see our entry point. If on the opposite, the stock is trading in sort of a bull flag going up, then that's where our entry point would be there. So if the market continues to go down, that would be our entry point for these contracts, and then support target levels would be as follows, again based on previous price history. And then we would want to stop all losses if the stock price came back up above to the 125 range based on any rallies or strong buying. So that's where you would cut off your put position. So these are, again, put options on the downside and call options. So the stock could trade either way depending on the sentiment of the market. And that's sort of the idea for this specific trade. Now, let me know what you guys think about JP Morgan. Let me know what you think is going to happen with some of the financials. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well. It's pretty interesting with what is going on lately. Hope everyone is staying safe. Thanks again for watching.